Now that we have completed our tour of the development environment in Wix, we are going to take a deep dive into what is the backbone of development in Wix, and that is the backend. This is something that we're going to be using and talking about extensively throughout the course, and it is the main difference between this course and the previous course where we learned how to be mostly front-end developers. So before we hop in and start showing some practical examples of how to use the backend, let's talk a little bit about what the backend is and why we might want to use it. So first of all, what is the backend? It is essentially a dedicated server for your website, which is running on Node.js, meaning that you can essentially use JavaScript to write code in the backend that will act as a server for your website. It's a little different than what you might be familiar with if you are a general Node.js user or you're used to using a framework like Express.js. In the backend, we essentially build functions which are wrappers for HTTP requests between our site frontend and backend, and we'll discuss all of that in a few moments. Now that we understand what the backend is, let's try and understand why we might want to use the backend. Why isn't the front end good enough for us? And if you're coming from a development background, you probably know at least some of this answer already. So a few common uses for using the backend is to protect business logic, or essentially protect anything that you might need to protect. The reasoning behind this is that the code files that you write for your backend are not shipped along with your website to the client. That means somebody who is accessing your website has no access to the actual code that's written on your backend and only has access based on the functions that you expose and the permissions that you provide. That means that you can use your backend, for example, to write a super secret algorithm that calculates something that only people who are privy to that information within your business should know, and accept a certain input from somebody on the front end, do whatever calculation it is or whatever business logic you want to add there in the backend, and send that over to the front end without the person being exposed, without the user on the client side being exposed to the actual calculations that are happening or the actual business logic that exists behind the scenes. So that is one primary use case, I would say. I listed here as number one because I think that is the classic usage for backend. As well as protecting your business logic, it also allows you to provide more nuanced access to data. Wix out of the box does provide certain permissions and access to CMS collections, but sometimes you want to make it a little more nuanced like that based on certain criteria a user might have or a certain situation within which they are viewing the data, and we often will utilize the backend in order to provide that nuanced access to data. The third thing, which is also a very classic use case, is access to third-party APIs, and I'm bundling together with this circumventing CORS errors, which can occur if you are trying to access other websites or APIs via the front end, but from the back end, from a server, we can access third-party APIs and not encounter any kind of CORS error. In addition, it allows us to securely access our secrets, which are stored in the secrets manager, without having to expose sensitive information like API keys to the front end. Last but not least, it helps us access certain Velo APIs. These are different APIs that are related to the Wix Business Solutions, such as Wix Stores, Wix Bookings, that are only accessible from the backend because they require certain admin permissions. So those are four, I won't say the only uses for the backend, because maybe you can think of one more that I haven't, but these are really the most classic cases and reasons why we might want to use the Wix backend. After understanding why we might want to use the backend and its importance, let's hop in and understand how to use the backend. First, by exploring the different files that we can create there. So if you recall, we get to the backend by going over here to Code, and then finding the public and backend section. And here on the very top is our backend. You can see here I already created a y.txt file, which is the one that I presented to you in the previous lesson. And what we're going to do now is we're going to explore the other different file types that we can add to our backend. So to add a file into our backend, we're going to use this plus sign right over here. I'm just going to go click that, and you can see here that we have several different options for files that we can add. We can also add in folders in order to organize our different files. So first of all, I am going to talk about the web module. This is a updated version of this JSW file, which is deprecated. I'm going to mention it as well because if you are working on a Wix website that was created a few months or years ago, then you will most definitely see some JSW files there, and I want you to know how to use them. But if you are creating a new Wix website and building a new web app with Wix, then you should be using these web modules. These are the newer, not deprecated versions of our backend files. The web module is the file where we will create our backend functions as web methods, which can be exposed and accessed from our front end. In addition to these two file types, we have regular JS files. This is for writing additional JavaScript code that we want to access only from the backend, but does not need to be exposed directly as a web method or as a function to be accessed from our front end. It could be different utility codes or just code that we want to separate to make our primary JavaScript files, our primary web module files, less bulky. We also have the option to add various other files. Like for example, you could see here that I've added a text file, but it's really not very common. I can't even think of a use case besides adding sometimes a to-do list or something like that to the website. So I won't be talking very much about those. After these more generic files, we have a list of 4 different unique file types, which Wix has designated for very, very specific backend functionality, and we are going to dive into them more deeply later on in the course. Those are the scheduled jobs, the site API or HTTP functions, adding data hooks, and handling backend events. Let's start our journey in the backend by adding a new web module file. I'm just going to click right over here in order to add it in, and you can see that it adds a file with the name newmodule.web.js, and we can alter the name of this file. So for example, I can go ahead and just click backspace and then call this my first file. Okay, this is a pretty common naming convention using all lowercase and dashes in between. You can also use some other convention of your choosing, as long as it's just characters, dashes. There might be a few other things that are possible, but most characters here would be restricted in terms of the file name. I recommend keeping it simple. So after creating this file, you'll see that we can open it over here inside of our IDE. So first of all, you can see here the file name is over here on top, so you can keep track of which file you have open. And here we have a short explanation of how to use this type of file, but since I'm going to be explaining it to you, we don't need it, so I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it. So let's explore what we have here out of the box inside our .web.js file. So first of all, you can see here that we're importing permissions and web method from Wix web module. This is essentially a Velo API or a package built, a library built specifically by Wix for this purpose. And we are going to use both the permissions and the web method when we create the function that we are exporting. Under that, you see an example of an exported web method. So first of all, you can see here the keyword export. This indicates to us that this is a function that's going to be exported to our front end and accessible from our front end. We can also write functions here, for example, function test. And this is a function that is currently not exposed to our front end. That means no matter what, we will not be able to access the content of this function from our front end unless it is included within a web method that is exported. Okay, so that's what the significance of the export keyword here within the file. Another thing that the exporting allows us to do is to call these functions or web methods from within other backend files as well. So anything that is not exported will not be able to be accessed from outside the file. After that, we have this, which is the name of the web method. This one is called multiply. Then we declare the web method, and inside we pass two things. The first is the permissions, and the second is a function, okay, a nameless function. And we could, if we wanted, for example, here to return another function. So for example, I could use factor1 and factor2 as my parameters for this function over here. And I can return factor1, factor2 inside of my test function. And then instead of returning factor1 times factor2, I could return test factor1, factor2. Okay, in that manner, in order to make our web method a little less bulky and split it up into functions, but we always have to have a nameless function over here. So I cannot, for example, return test or just put the test function over here out of the box. Okay, so I can't do factor1, factor2 like that. I can't just call the function over here, and I can't just pass the function as a nameless function either. Okay, this will not work. We have to use the nameless function structure that was built into the web method, so something along these lines. Okay, let me return it now to the original state. And essentially what this function is doing over here is it's taking two parameters, so factor1, factor2, most likely numbers, and it is returning a multiplication of them. So this could be an example of hidden business logic. Obviously, there's nothing very complicated that's going on here. It's just a simple multiplication, but you can imagine some other business logic that you would want to put over here and hide and only return the result of that business logic, which in this case is a multiplication. Two more things which I would like to mention before we do our first exercise is, first of all, the permissions. So these permissions determine who can call this web method from the front end. At the moment, it's set to permissions.anyone, but we could go ahead and change this to one of three things: admin, anyone, or site member. So if it is set to admin, that means only somebody who is logged into the website as an admin can call this web method. Anyone means any user on the site, any anonymous user can call this web method. And site member means that only somebody who is a site member can call this web method. When you are testing in the backend, which is the next thing that I'm going to talk about, you are always testing as an admin, so these permissions are not relevant. It's only relevant when you are using your live site. So anytime that you are previewing or testing in the backend, these permissions are not relevant. I'm going to leave it at anyone, which is usually what I do for web methods because I like to implement my own more nuanced permissions with regard to things, and we'll talk about that later on when we talk about data and start building out our web app. Last thing I want to point out before our exercise is regarding testing. Inside of the Wix backend, we have something called functional testing, which allows us to run our backend functions or web methods and see if they are working. So I'm going to test here by clicking on this blue arrow that you see here on the side. It's important to note that you'll only see this blue arrow for web methods or functions that are exported. If I remove this export keyword, then you can see that the blue arrow goes away. Once I click on the blue arrow, it will open up a new window that looks like this. And we have the option here to provide the parameters for our function. So as we said, it's going to be here 2 numbers. So for example, I will have here number 4, and I will also have number 5. And then I can go ahead and click the run button over here. And you can see that our function was called with 4 and 5, and it returned 20, which is 4 times 5. So that means that everything is working and we're ready to ship this and share it with all our users. So that is an example of how to run a functional testing. And now that we have a general understanding of web methods and how to build them, we are going to do our first exercise. So for our first exercise, we are going to build a very simple function. And instead of having a multiplication function, we are going to build an addition function. So essentially, I would like you to build a web method just like the one that we saw before, but instead of having the 2 numbers being multiplied, it should return the numbers added together. So the sum of the 2 numbers. And I encourage you to go ahead and erase the boilerplate web method before you start to plan this out and write out your web method. And I'm going to pause right now to give you some time to do this, and you can try and do it on your own. If you finished or you want to kind of check out and see how I'm going to do it, then you can go ahead and continue the video, and I will be doing it together with you. I hope you found success with the exercise or at least gave it a try. Now we're going to go ahead and do it together. So first of all, we are going to export our web method. So let's use the export keyword. And we're going to declare our web method as a new constant, which I'm just going to call add. This is going to be equal to the web method. And inside of the web method, we're going to have 2 parameters. One is going to be our permissions. So permissions dot anyone. I didn't define what permissions would be in the exercise, so whatever you did here is fine. And we're going to have our nameless function as well. So I'm going to open up parentheses for the parameters, and we're going to have here number 1 and number 2. Then we are going to open our function and return number 1 plus number 2. And then I'm just going to go ahead and format this just like that. And last but not least, we should always run a test to make sure that our code is working as expected. So I'm going to go ahead and click the run button right over here. Let's add in 2 numbers. So I'm going to try again with 4 and 5 and hit run. And we can see here that it was returned with 9. So my function is working. It's adding both numbers together. The real challenge here was not the JavaScript part, I hope. It's a rather simple function, but just getting used to how the web method is supposed to be built. I'll tell you the truth that often I will just use the boilerplate web method as a framework and write my new web method inside of it and not always type out every single web method from scratch. But this is good practice just to make sure that we have a deep understanding of what the web method is and how it's structured. Now that we have successfully created our own web method, let's talk about how we can import and access this web method from the front end of our website or the page code. So let's go over here to Home. This is the code from our home page. Here we have that console log that we wrote while we were playing with the GitHub integration, if you watched that lesson. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of that log. And what we're going to do over here is we're just going to import our backend function. And we're going to do that using the same import terminology that you saw on top of the .web.js file. So we're going to use the keyword import, and we're going to use the function name over here. And then we're just going to say from. In order to import files from the backend, we're going to say backend slash, and now the name of the file, which was my first file, my first file. I can type, don't worry. My first file dot web, and that's all that we need. Okay, we don't need to add .js at the end. That's all we need in order to import a file. I will make a note that if we had this file, for example, inside of a folder, then after the backend, we would also need to add in the folder name here. And if we had it nested under multiple folders, then and so on and so forth. Okay, so pretty standard file path. Okay, nothing too original over here. So backend slash my first file dot web, and we're importing the add web method or backend function from there. Now that we have access to it in our front end, we can call it using regular JavaScript over here inside of our onReady. Or for example, we could add in an element which would trigger the firing or the calling of this function. And that's what I'm going to do in order to make this super clear. On our homepage, we have a button already from a previous lesson. If you don't have the button, you can always go ahead and add in a new button element. And what we're going to do is, first of all, I'm going to change the name of this button inside of our code. So essentially the element ID. And I'm going to do that here by opening up the properties and events. And I'm going to go over here to where it says ID. And instead of having it just say button 2, let's call this our Start Now button. And that's just because that's what's written on our button, and it'll be very clear to me which button we're talking about when I see Start Now button in the code versus just button 2. I'm just going to click enter to confirm the ID change. And then here inside of the onReady function, I am going to select our button using $W notation. I am assuming some rudimentary understanding of how the front end in Wix works, as that was the topic of my first course, how to become a front-end developer in Wix. I'll try and give pointers here and there as we progress, just for those of you who may not have seen the course, but I am assuming that knowledge as a starter point for this course. So I'm going to select the button using the $W notation. This is kind of like jQuery for those of you who may have experienced that in your web development background. And I'm going to select the button. So I'm just going to use the ID over here. So Start Now button. Then I'm going to add in an on-click event listener. And I'm going to run the add function inside of the Start Now button. I am going to just hard code 2 parameters in here. And let's say, for example, 3 and 7. Obviously, if you are using this in your front end, it's very likely that you are going to be creating a more dynamic setup, for example, using some inputs. But since our primary goal here is to demonstrate the relationship between the backend and the front end, I am just putting in 2 hard-coded values. One thing that is important to note here is that every time we use a backend function inside of our front-end code, it is an asynchronous action. It is an interaction between client side and server side. And so if we need to do something after we execute this add function, we are going to need to use either .then or use async await in this manner. So async await and essentially await the promise. So for example, if we want to get the result back here from the add function and I want to store it in a variable, I will have to go like this: const result equals to await add 37. And it can't just be used as a regular function, even though the web method that we built in the backend was not an asynchronous function to begin with. As soon as we import it to the front end, it becomes asynchronous because it is a client-server interaction. Behind the scenes, essentially what's happening here is our front end is making an HTTP request to our server, and I'm going to demonstrate that to you as well once we take a look at the live site. Once we get the result here, what I'll do is I'll just add in a console log with the log of result, just so that we can see that it's working and we can see the actual result here on the front end. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to first go into preview mode and show you what this looks like in preview mode, and then head to the live site to show you what it looks like there, as well as expand a little bit on what's going on behind the scenes when we call a backend function from our front end. We are going to have a dedicated lesson later on all about testing and debugging, so I'm not going to dive too much into the different options that we have for testing and what preview mode means. But essentially, once we go into preview mode, it allows us both to view the design of our site, and it opens up a in-editor developer console over here on the bottom, okay, which we can open up just like this. So you can see here developer console. And it allows us to see some logs that we would see in a typical developer console in the browser. And I'm emphasizing the some. We'll talk about that more later on in the course. Let's go ahead and click our Start Now button just to see what happens. So I click the button, and you can see here that inside of the developer console, it's now displaying the console log of result 10. You may have noticed it took a little longer than you would expect a regular JavaScript function of this simplicity to run. And again, that is because we have the asynchronous communication here going on between the front end and the back end. Now that we understand how this looks in preview mode, let's take a look at how this would look on our live site. Here is our live site after publishing. And what I'm going to do here is first open up our console log. So I'm going to go here to inspect. I'm using Chrome. You might be using something else, so it might be a little different. But I'm going to go over here into the console, and I'm going to click the Start Now button, just like we did before. And you can see here that we get a console result, just like we did in the Wix preview mode. What being on the live site allows us to do is to take a deeper look at what's happening here behind the scenes in terms of network requests. This might be a little complex for some people taking the course. If you feel it is, it's not fundamental knowledge that you need in order to be a successful full stack Wix developer, but I think it's an interesting bonus that might make your understanding of what's going on a little deeper. So let's go over here to our network tab. And you can see here that essentially what happened is that behind the scenes, we have a network request that was made to this URL. So you can see here the name, the domain of the site, /course2, /API, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite a long endpoint. But every time I click the Start Now button, let me go ahead and click it again, you can see that a new network request happens. So even though it's structured to look like an imported function in the front end, essentially every time we call that function, there is a network request between our front end and our server, which is not included in the client-side files. As I mentioned, in addition to the web modules, there is also the deprecated version of the backend, which is our JSW files. As I mentioned earlier, it is not recommended to create new code in JSW files, but it is highly likely that you will come across it, as this is what Wix has operated on for years, and the web modules were only introduced a few months ago, so early mid 2024. Let's go ahead and see what these JSW files look like and how they differ from web modules. To add a JSW file, I'm just going to click the plus button and click add.jsw file. Again, you will likely not be adding these in yourself, but finding already existing ones. And I'm going to name it demo.jsw. You can see here that the ending of the file is different because it's JSW and not web.js. And you can see that the icon here is blue and says JSW and not JS. So those are ways that you can identify that it's a JSW file versus a web method or web module file. Now that we have created the file, let's take a peek inside and see how it differs from the web modules. So first of all, you will notice that there is no import anywhere over here. So we're not importing permissions. Let me get rid of all of this. We're not importing permissions or web method from any Velo libraries, and we just simply export a function. So in a way, it is a little simpler than web methods because we don't need to pass in multiple parameters, one with permissions and one with the actual function. But what the JSW files did in the past is it separated out the topic of permissions to a UI-based decision. So here you can see that we're exporting the function just like this. And if I go back into the file directory over here, so demo.jsw, and I click the three dots over here near the file, you'll see that I have the option to edit the web module permissions. Okay, and this is how JSW files get edited instead of, the permissions of a JSW file get edited instead of including them in the file itself like we do with web methods. So you'll see here I can select from admin, site member, anyone. And as I add in new functions to the file, they would all be added in here under this permissions modal. Okay, so those are the primary difference between web methods, web.js files and the JSW files. In terms of how they are imported to the front end and how they run and the functional testing, it is all the same. So you should feel pretty comfortable there, no matter which one you are used to.